Hello everyone, and welcome to the fourth Cocoa programming tutorial. In this tutorial, I'm going to be covering how we can connect our interface that we built in the last tutorial to our code that we're going to be building in this tutorial. So just as a friendly reminder, in the last tutorial I showed you how to enable garbage collection, which we want for all these tutorials, so just remember that going forward because I probably won't remind you after this. So just again, enable garbage collection for all these tutorials. And I also showed you how to build your interface. So all we did here was we dragged a label from our objects library onto our window. We expanded this to the edges of the window. We centered the text using the attributes inspector. That's all we really did for the label. And we also added a button. We double-clicked to edit the text that's in the button, and we said say hello. And then we expanded the button to the edges as well. So that's really all we did in the last tutorial. And now in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how you can connect your class or your code to this window. So anytime you want to make connections or connect your code to your interface, you want to create an Objective-C class. And I'm just going to do that right now, and then we'll get into specifics of how this works. So to create a new class in Xcode 4, we can go ahead down to the bottom right, and there's a file templates chooser, and we can select from multiple file templates that Apple offers. So you can also see that there's different options if you hit the pop-up, but we want Mac OS X as our option. So go ahead and select your Objective-C class from here, and we want to drag the Objective-C class over to our groups and files. So once we've dragged it over there, we can now call this, and I'm going to call it for this tutorial, App Controller. And it's a fairly common name to have when you're building these simple applications, and I'll talk about why. So essentially, this very simple program that we have going on has two kind of main components. The first one is our window, which is known as the view, and the view is just when we connect our what the user will see when you launch the application. So anything the user really sees is what you can consider the view. Our controller is our app controller class that we're creating here, and our controller is the code that controls all the objects that are on the view. So the view and the controller are linked together in that way so that the controller controls all the objects that are on screen. So with that out of the way, now we want to just talk about all the different elements that we want to incorporate into our app controller class. So if we're going to be connecting our class to our view here, we want to be able to connect the right objects. So let's look at the two objects that we've created. We've created a label and a button. So the label, how are we going to be able to manipulate this label? Because again, our program, we want to hit a button and we want to set some text. We want to change the text of our label. So to change this label, we have to have an instance or a variable in our app controller of this label. So our app controller is going to have a variable that it can change in its controller, and that will change whatever you see on the view. So our app controller will have some variable, and we'll probably call it label, and as we change the label in our controller, it will change whatever the view has that we've connected. So again, our controller has to have a variable for this label, because otherwise we have no way of changing the value of this label that's in our window. So for our label, we want a variable in our class. So that's out of the way. The second thing we want is for our button. And let's get thinking a little bit more about what we need for the button. So you might think that we also need a variable for the button, but we actually don't for this case. All we're going to be doing with the button is when the button is pressed, it's going to send a message to our app controller to run a method in our controller. So all this button really needs is a connection, and it needs a method that it's going to be calling for our app controller. So that's all that this button really is going to have. It's just going to have a message that it sends to our controller that will call that method. So again, just to recap, we have a variable for our button, and we need a method for our, sorry, I said that wrong. We need a variable for our label, and we need a method for our button. So those are the two elements that we need in our app controller. So let's go over to our app controller now. And anytime you want to add variables, you always put them between the brackets, as you would know if you know Objective-C classes at all. And there's two important things that we have to know about when we're creating objects for our interface, or different variables for our interface. So what we're going to be doing here is we want to connect our variables and our methods so that we can connect them in our interface. So we want to be able to, when our interface builder is looking for methods and variables that it can connect, we want to have specific things that can be connected. So there's two important macros or pound defines that we use in our class or our controller that tell the interface builder this is going to be an outlet and this is going to be an action. So these two things are called IB outlet and IB action. And an IB outlet really is just a variable that will connect from our code to our view. So anytime you see IB outlet, that means that the variable can change something that's on our view. So that's what the IB outlet macro means. An IB action is for any method that will be connected from our interface into our program or our code. So we'll get into how both of these work in a second. So let's just start with our label here. So our label, we need a connection from our controller class to our view. So we want an outlet. You can think of an outlet as just out. We want it out from our controller class going out to our view. So our IB outlet, and IB just stands for interface builder. So IB outlet is what we have to say anytime we want to create a variable that's going to connect to our view. So IB outlet is just the macro, and IB outlet means absolutely nothing to our code. It actually means absolutely nothing, literally. But Interface Builder looks for these little pound defines or macros, and it will identify that this variable is something that it can connect in Interface Builder. So IB outlet doesn't change anything really about how the variable works. It just means that the variable we're creating is going to be connected in our interface. So for a label, anytime you really have a text field or a label or anything of that sort, what you want to create is an NS text field. And I know that sounds weird for a label, but an NS text field really is just the general text class that has anything to do with text on the screen in generic terms. So anytime you see a text field, which is like you can type something into it, that would be a text field, or anytime you even see just a label, these can be represented as NS text field classes. So I know even though it's a label, an NS text field is the actual class that we use for both little text fields and text that you'll just see on screen. So that just created our label object of NS text field, and since we have the IB outlet macro, it's going to be connecting this IB outlet to our interface. So with that, now we can create our method that we want to create for our button. So whenever our button's pressed, we want to have this method called. And this method is going to be IB action. Now, IB action, all that IB action means is void. So there's no return for this function. So, method, I shouldn't say function. So IB action, all it means is void. And void is our return type, so it means it's not going to return anything. So it's, other than putting IB action as the return type, which just means void, there's no difference between the methods that we create in normal Objective-C. IB action just notifies our interface that we can connect this method to our program or our interface. So the action that we want to say is just say hello. And say hello is going to take one parameter, and say hello again is going to be the connection that we're going to make between our button and our code. So say hello, anytime you create any action, or IB action, any method that will be connected from interface back into our program, you want to have one, just one parameter, and the parameter takes ID as its type, and ID just means any object. So ID can be any object that is sending a message, so ID and sender will be just the variable name. So ID sender, again, what this means is that for example, our button, when our button's pressed, the ID sender is really just the button. It's whatever is really calling or sending this message. So that's really all that ID sender means. Again, ID just means any class. So anytime you create any method for any interface elements, you want to have this layout: IB action, and then you'll have whatever the method name is with a parameter of ID sender. So that's how every single method that you ever connect from your interface to your code will look like. So that's all we have to do, and those are the two things that we want to connect. Again, IB outlet will let the interface know that we want to connect this label from our code to our interface. And IB action, again, just means void. And IB action will just let our interface know as well that this method can be used to connect our interface to our code. So we'll get into how we're going to implement these two things later on, but first we want to determine how we can connect these things. So connecting is kind of fun in Xcode or in Cocoa development, and all you have to do for this is you just have to create a new object on the workbench. So anytime you want to make connections from your code to your interface, you have to create a new object of your class that you created. So I'll go through how we do this, and it's pretty simple. So all we have to do is go over to the bottom right here, and under the Objects tab, we want to have an object that is known as NSObject. So NSObject, and as you can see, it can also just be represented as this object, so you could type in object as well. But object is just the generic object, of course. I'm just repeating myself now, but it's just the generic object that we can use to apply any class as an object. So we can drag this object into our workbench, and now we can drop it in, and as you can see, it just creates this generic object now that we can potentially connect our code to our interface. So now what we want to do, anytime you create a new object and you want to use a class, our class for example is AppController, you want to change the class of this this object. So to do this, you go over to the top right, and you'll see that right up here in our this button right here is known as the Identity Inspector. And right at the top you can see Custom Class, and this is the class that you're going to be using that the object will be. So for example, this object, we want it to be represented as an instance of our app controller, because our app controller contains all the code that will connect to our interface. So app controller is the class that we want for this object. So now this object, as you can see, it now says app controller right next to the object. So that's what we want. That's what we wanted to have. And now this object right here is an instance of this app controller class. So very nice, and what this allows us to do is now connect all the variables and the methods that we had in our class to the different pieces that we have on our view. So to make a connection between objects, what we have to do is what's known as control drag, and basically all you do is hold down the control key and drag from one element to the other. So for the first thing, we want to connect our label to our code. So what we want to do is have from our app controller, we want to make a connection from our app controller to the label. So what we do is we hold down control, and you just click, and now you just drag, and you hold control and drag over to your label, and as you can see, it forms this little field around the label. And you also see that it doesn't do anything around the button because we don't have an instance of NS button. So we only have something that we can use for the label. So we can click on that, and when we release, you'll see that the outlet's little HUD pops up here, and the only option we have is to select label. And when it does a little blink, and now it has made the connection between our app controller and our label. So another thing that we want to do is connect our button into our app controller, because our button, when it gets pressed, wants to send a message to our app controller to run that method. So what we want to do is control and click, control drag from the button over to our app controller, and when you release it, it will give you the received actions. So these are all the actions that are sent from our interface to our code. And the only action that we had was that one IB action that we created, which was say hello. So when we click that, now it has made the connection between our button and our app controller. So a nice way to overview what you just did, if you don't know if you've made the proper connections or not, you can right click on any object and it'll show you all the connections that you've made. So at the very top here, you can see that we've made an outlet, or our outlets. The only connection we've made is with this label, and it even highlights up here what connection we made. So in our label outlet from our object, we attached it to that text that we had on screen. So that's what we wanted to do for that outlet. And also for our say hello, we connected the button, as you can see, our round textured button, we connected that to the say hello method that's in our app controller class. So that's great. Now we have everything that we wanted connected and everything should be good. However, of course, we have to actually implement what we want to happen, because of course we want to have something happen when we press our say hello method. Because we declared, I should say, the different methods and variables that we want to have, but we never said how say hello is going to work. So of course we have to do this in our implementation. This is our interface, and we want to define or implement how this method is going to work. So switch over to our appcontroller.m, and in it you can get rid of all this code that you see right here, because we're not actually going to need it. All you want to do in app controller is you want to enable, or you don't want to enable, you just want to call the method that we did in app controller. .h. So in appcontroller.h we had our IB action say hello. So generally you can just copy this if you want, go back into appcontroller.m and paste it. And now we just want to define how this method is going to work. So when say hello is called, so when our button is pressed, say hello is sent to our app controller to run our say hello method. So say hello label, so this is our instance variable of our label, and we just want to set the string value of our label. We want to set it to a value of hello YouTube, and put a few exclamation marks, and there you go. That's all that say hello is going to do. It's going to just set our label, going to set the string value to a value of hello YouTube. So that's all that our label is going to do. And now we can go back into our, or we don't even have to go back into anything, but we can just go to our interface if we want. Doesn't really matter. But now that we've made the proper implementation, just to review one more time, we made a connection from our app controller to our label. So our app controller now knows what it's going to change with our label. And when a say hello is pressed, it's going to send the say hello message to our app controller, which will then run our say hello method. So let's go ahead and run this and build and run, and as you can see we get the lesson 4 window right here. Let's just zoom in for added effect, and as you can see when we press the say hello button, boom, we get hello YouTube. That's exactly what we wanted to happen in our class. So anyway, that was pretty much just the overview of very simple connections that you can make between your app controller or your controller class to your view. So that's all I really wanted to show you for this tutorial, and much more will come in future tutorials for all these different connections and other stuff. But I'll also show you a few other ways to connect there's a bunch of ways to make connections in Xcode. But the general idea is that we create a class and a view. The class or the controller object will connect to the view, and we just define in our app controller or our controller class whatever we want to connect to our interface by using IB outlet and IB action. And then in our view, we connect the different objects that we want from our app controller, like our label, and we can make connections between our button back to our app controller. So that's just an overview of different things that we like to do in our connection making between our controller classes and our interfaces. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and many more are always on the way. And I enjoy making these Cocoa tutorials. Sometimes it takes me a little while because I'm busy doing other things, but be patient, and more tutorials are always in production. If you have any questions, please leave your questions in the comments below, and also please subscribe to the channel. And also you can subscribe to my Twitter account, just AppleProg, P-R-O-G, and that will just give you some updates to when these tutorials are posted as well, if you are into Twitter. So anyway, that's just what Lesson 4 was all about, making connections between your controller class that we created by adding an object to our workbench, and creating connections between that and our interface. So anyway, I'll see you next tutorial.